Today I'm going to be talking about Austrian economics and a particular area within Austrian economics that's becoming popular, which I'm going to label the study of private governance. In Austria, as you know, Austrian economics has made a lot of contributions, but in the United States it's also tremendously important. When I studied in graduate school, one of my fields was in Austrian economics, and there's a lot of people in the United States practicing and studying Austrian economics, so I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on the American branch of Austrian economics. In history, we had a lot of contributions by the Austrians from people like Menger and Hayek, talking about spontaneous order, talking about emergent order, talking about how things that most people thought that government needed to do could actually emerge privately. So things like money could emerge privately through the distinct actions of different individuals pursuing their own interest and seeing markets produce things like money. What I'm going to be focusing on today is asking how far we can extend this theory, the theory of emergent order. Most people say that markets can do a lot of things. They can do many different things, but most people say that government needs to do certain things, specifically creating the framework for markets to exist. So even among Austrian-influenced economists, such as Israel Kurzner from NYU, they say that markets can do certain things, but they can't do everything. So, for example, Kurzner says, without enforceability of contract, the market cannot operate. It follows that those institutions cannot be created by the market itself. Markets need governmental extra market enforcement. Okay, so that's the standard view, is that spontaneous orders emerge within a system of governmentally created rules. But what I'm going to be talking about now is a set of research that talks about how the rules itself can emerge from the market. It turns out that in many markets, many important markets, evidence suggests that rules commonly come from the market participants rather than coming from the state. So a couple things that I'll just mention, and then I'll get into my specific examples. The law merchant was a system of private, basically arbitration that emerged in Middle Ages. The rules of the world's first stock markets. When markets started emerging, government didn't really understand how stock markets worked. The rules for the world's first insurance markets. There were very complex contracts in a lot of these markets. Government didn't really understand them well, and so market participants created rules themselves. So I'm going to be summarizing some of this research. So the study of private governance involves positive research questions, such as what are the main sources of order in markets in history and today? Other positive questions, do complicated markets depend on externally imposed government rules, or can those rules emerge endogenously, come from the market itself? In addition to positive questions, there's a lot of normative implications of this research. So if we want to see successful markets, do we need to have a lot of government regulations? These are normative questions. If markets can regulate themselves, how much can they regulate themselves? Should parties be able to opt in to different systems of private enforcement, for example, through arbitration, mediation? Should these things be restricted, encouraged, or what have you? Okay, so some of the main researchers in the United States who are influenced by Austrian economics are listed here. There's a lot of people doing work in this, but I'm going to be focusing on the best of all work, which is by myself. I've got this book, Private Governance, which will be forthcoming with Oxford University Press, so I will be focusing a little bit more on my own research, but just so you know, there's a lot of people doing research in the study of private governance. Okay, so one of the assumptions that I'm going to make, which I think is fairly reasonable, is that there's potential problems in markets, always. Things like fraud, things like potential violations of property rights. They're near ubiquitous, these potential problems. And a lot of people represent these things as prisoner's dilemma. And the idea is people could be better off cooperating, but in certain cases, some people will want to cheat. I think that's oftentimes the case. Where the average theorist says government needs to solve the prisoner's dilemma, the student of private governance takes a different approach. So Oliver Williamson, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, says that lots of people are what he calls legal centralists, where they basically assume government will solve all of the problems. He says most studies of exchange assume efficacious rules of law regarding contract disputes are in place and applied by the courts in an informed, sophisticated, and low-cost way. Students of private governance, in contrast, ask the following questions. Does the government have the knowledge to solve the problem? So applying ideas from Hayek and Mises and applying this to courts and regulators. Sometimes they're not aware of a problem. Sometimes they're not aware of the best way to solve it. Does government have an incentive to solve a problem? So that would be the marriage of Austrian economics and public choice. Does government have the ability to solve a problem in a low-cost way? So sometimes problem like fraud, they might know about it, but have no ability to stop it. So the examples I'm going to highlight very briefly are the following. Stockbrokers in 17th century Amsterdam. When they started creating markets, government had not seen such sophisticated markets before. Government really didn't know how to enforce contracts. Stockbrokers in London in 18th century as well. They thought that stock markets were a form of gambling, and they said, we're not going to enforce contracts in this. Stock markets. In addition, we have insurance markets. In London, very sophisticated contracts. Government did not understand them. In San Francisco, I'll be focusing on this for a couple minutes. In the gold rush, people went into San Francisco in the 1850s, and there's basically very weak, almost no government police, and so people basically were in a state of what might be called anarchy. In addition, after the fall, in the 20th century, zoom forward, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of people basically doing business in countries where courts were extremely weak, extremely, in certain ways, corrupt. They couldn't enforce contracts. What do people do? In the modern world, over the internet, there's lots of people who conduct business, and they're faced with fraudsters from all around the world, and government doesn't have the ability to track these people down. So I'm going to just highlight what parties do when they face problems that government can't solve. So where the legal centralist assumes that government is going to solve the problem, a researcher in private government says, in many cases, government can't solve the problem. They don't solve the problem. And if not, what are people going to do? The researcher in private governance says if an unmet need exists, can private parties seek to fulfill those unmet needs? All right. And the main point that I'm going to be emphasizing is unmet needs are potential profit opportunities, and focusing on cases where people figure out ways of solving their problems by themselves rather than relying on government and profiting as a result. Okay, so I'll just give a couple quick examples. In Amsterdam in the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company emerged. It was supposed to be a short-term venture. They issued shares, and they turned out to be a long-term venture. And over time, a secondary market in shares starting emerging. People started applying contracts, financial contract techniques that they learned from money markets from Antwerp to stock markets. And they started basically trading in shares. Rather than originally planned, the original plan was you had to go to the office of the East India Company to trade shares. You could do it on your own and go to the exchange and change shares. Within early times, people actually started outlawing all types of financial contracts. Here's some plates from Amsterdam where they said, squeeze the speculators tight, down with speculators. So they outlawed short selling, they outlawed futures contracts. Nevertheless, markets developed very many types of sophisticated contracts, and it turns out they did have short sales, they did have forward contracts, they did have options, they did have other things, including hypothecation, securitization, many very sophisticated contracts that were not enforceable by law. How did it work? Well, government didn't enforce the contracts, but it turns out there was reputation mechanisms. So I'll just read a couple quotes from a 17th century stockbroker. It says, when the loss occurs, losers are expected to pay at least what they have available at the moment. When the wound is fresh, there would be no new injury. He says, to be sure, there's widespread honesty and expedition on the exchange. Nobody changes the decisions which he makes in momentary passion. Such honesty, cooperation, and accuracy are admirable and surprising. So it turns out what they did was they had private reputation mechanisms. If you cheat me, I don't deal with you again. If you cheat one person in the exchange, everybody knows about it, and that prevents that person from gaining business. If we zoom forward to London, same type of things were happening. Government did not enforce contracts, and you can read about this in Adam Smith. He says that people government didn't enforce contracts. It says buying stocks by time is prohibited by law. He says, however, in the same manner that all laws against gaming never hindered it, people do it anyway. He says, yet all the great sums that are lost are punctually paid. He says, persons who game must keep their credit, else nobody will deal with them. It's quite the same for stock jobbing. They who do not keep their credit will be turned out, and in the change out would be called a lame duck. So the origin of the term lame duck is people who are cheating. They're basically kicked out. Over time, basically in London, what they did was they transformed coffee houses into private clubs. The London Stock Exchange used to be called Jonathan's Coffee House, and they started creating and enforcing rules. If you violated the rules, they would put your name on the board. If you violated them more than once, you'd get kicked out of this private club. And eventually the name, the motto they adopted was, my word is my bond. So if you wanted to be a member of the London Stock Exchange, you had to be a trustworthy individual. Voltaire, this great quote, probably some of you have seen it, but he says, go into the exchange, that place more venerable than many a court, and you'll see the representatives of all the nations assembled for the profit of mankind. There the Jew, the Mohammedan, and the Christian deal with another as if they were the same religion and reserve the name of infidel for those who go bankrupt. In modern times, we still have self-regulatory organizations. Up until a few years ago, you had to pay $5 million to become a member of the New York Stock Exchange. If you get kicked out of this club, you're losing $5 million. You're not going to want to cheat somebody if the stakes are less than $5 million. The next thing I'm going to focus is zooming to the United States. In addition, we've got the New York Stock Exchange, but we've got all types of things in all types of markets where merchants cannot rely on government to enforce their property rights, enforce their contracts. In San Francisco, thousands of people basically went in a short period of time into San Francisco right after the gold rush, and there's basically documentation of how there was no police, there was no jail, And merchants were faced with a lot of criminals from all over the world. And instead of relying on non-existent government solutions, they hired a system of private police. And I hope that I've got some pictures. Yeah, here's some gangs. They were coming from Australia, beating up people, going into establishments, smashing their things. And so from very early times, this is a paper from 1850, just talking about how they had private night watchmen bundled with the real estate. If you're a landlord and your real estate is dangerous, you're not going to be able to rent it out for much. So what they did was they hired private police. Here's some examples of the private police. In one case, there was a government official who killed a businessman, and the government didn't do anything about it. So the private police actually had their own private trial against the businessman, and against the government official. They actually hanged the government official. This is a newspaper. Chief of Police is the government police, praises special officers of the private police for their gallant defense of rioting strikers in the morning hours. These private police still exist in San Francisco to this day. There was a movie made about them with Mila Jovovich and Christian Slater. Not a very good movie, but an interesting movie that there's movies about private police. And here's what they look like. They look very similar to government police, except for they're privately financed by merchants. I did a survey of them in San Francisco, of their customers actually, and I said, why do you pay money for private police when you could rely on government police? And the responses are very interesting. People are like, I need specialized service, I want people to arrive on time. One of the responses said, this is a joke, right? Can I really rely on government police? So a lot of government police just are not responsive to merchants' needs. If you have a person in your store who's acting unruly, government police don't really care, and they won't send anybody. So instead, people relied on private police. Up until a couple years ago, they were fully deputized. They had full police powers. And they're today the only people in San Francisco allowed to patrol from property to property with fully armed. So this is just another example. So I've talked about some examples of contract enforcement. Here's some examples of property rights enforcement. And then the last example I'll just give is in electronic commerce today. We've got a lot of people who conduct business over the internet, and faced with people who are hacking into accounts, people are placing fraudulent orders. And when you interact over the internet, it opens up markets to lots of people, but that also opens you up to lots of fraud. And in many cases, people can't turn to government. So here's a true story, actually. I was ordering this tie. I was trying to order this tie over eBay, and the person sent me the wrong tie. And I started sending emails to the person. They said, no, wouldn't respond to any of my emails. And so I could have gone to government to get this contract enforced. Turns out I didn't have to go to government. I went to a private rule enforcing body named eBay. And I said, they sent me the wrong tie, and they're not responding to my emails. They sent me a paisley tie. I know Will likes paisley ties, but I can't wear paisley ties. And so rather than me going to government, eBay had this private trial, and they said, okay, yep, we know you're in the right, because they have a record. The guy didn't even respond to my emails. And so they said, okay, fine, here's your money back. Okay, so this is an example of private trial, private arbitration as an alternative to government trials. So as a result, this person's now kicked off eBay. I went to go check their, their status. They're not on eBay anymore. In addition to things like eBay, you have things like PayPal. PayPal, when they were founded, had lots of people hacking into their accounts, stealing money, and they went to government, and government didn't know who any of these people were. Turns out some of them were from Kazakhstan. They reported to the FBI, and the FBI is like, okay, all right, now what do we do? Which one of us has a jurisdiction over Kazakhstan? Nobody does. They couldn't even find these people. Even if they found them, they didn't have legal authority to go after them. So as a result, PayPal and other private firms developed various mechanisms to prevent things like fraud from occurring. They have scoring methods. When you place a transaction, PayPal or your credit card company assigns a score. They say, this is 90% sure that it's a legitimate transaction, or this is 50% sure that it's a legitimate transaction. And what they do is they turn down transactions that are more likely to be fraudulent, and as a result, the better they are at predicting fraud ex ante, the less they need to rely on government rules ex post. Okay, so just imagine this. You can interact with anybody around the world, and PayPal knows whether this is going to be a fraudulent transaction ahead of time, and the better they know, the less you need to rely on government. Okay, so it's putting this decision, which could have been a legal decision, into the hands of a private company. PayPal does this, Visa does this, many different groups do this. All right, I have 2 more hours, right, Professor Nick? Okay. All right, so lessons. The more things are problems, the more people view this as potential loss, the more they view this as a potential profit opportunity. PayPal could have gone out of business if they hadn't addressed this problem. Merchants in San Francisco would have gone out of business had they not addressed these problems. Stockbrokers would not have been able to engage in the very sophisticated contracts had they not addressed the problem. So what they do, it's very common for people to hire parties to assume risks and manage it on our behalf. In modern times, futures markets do this. When you go to the futures exchange, would you want to make a contract with somebody as crazy like this, looking like this? No, not really. But when you go to the futures market, the futures exchange assumes risks on our behalf. We're not actually making a contract with the other party when we go to the futures exchange. We're actually making a contract with the futures exchange, and the futures exchange is managing risk on our behalf. Okay, so I guess I'll just wrap up here. Is in the study of private governance, what we've been doing, I and other people have been doing, is documenting many ways that people create rules, enforce rules privately rather than relying on government, dealing with friends, dealing with honest people, different repeat dealings, making contracts self-enforcing, relying on things like reputation mechanisms, hiring third parties to assume and manage risk, hiring third parties to create and enforce rules. The advantages of all this is market participants always see the needs that they're facing, and market participants have more knowledge of what the problems are than government. Government officials often don't care. And so private parties see these problems and they take steps to solve them. And just here's just a small list of, Will Luther has contributed to this list, but there's just tons of great articles on this, but I'll just conclude by recommending the best one of all. Thank you very much.